What's going on, everybody? I'm back with another video. This video is going to be looking at the CONCACAF Nations League final between Mexico and the United States. The United States ended up winning in extra time 3-2, and this is going to be tactically how they played and how they ended up winning. So before we start, check out my book. It is on Amazon, and I think if you like this video, if you like tactics, you'll really like the book, so be sure to check that out in the description below. And then also, I made this video using Keyframe, so if you're interested in making content, be sure to check that out as well. But let's get right into it. So Mexico, they built from the back using primarily three players in the central corridors, or a back three, and in their first third, when their goalkeeper was involved in build-up, their goalkeeper would be the third player, and then their wide central defender would come into a wider position a little bit higher up the field. And early in the game, the United States often were broken because of this, when they would press from out to in, with wingers coming from the wide areas pressing narrow and trying to force the ball into the central corridors. Now what this did was it allowed the central striker of the United States to drop into a deeper position to try and cover the holding midfielder. And although this was effective, the third central defender, who went higher up the field for Mexico, often became unmarked and the source of progression for Mexico, as we see here. It was then ultimately Weston McKennie's job to cover this for the United States and jump into the wide area, breaking the connection between him and his holding midfield partner in their 5-2-3, which then overextended the United States' defensive shape, which allowed them to struggle early in the game. After Mexico's first progression, moving into the midfield third now, we see their back three being formed by three central defenders, and from here, they would often use a double pivot to then create press-resistant triangles from the first and second line. And now we clearly see the United States and their 5-2-3 shape, with two holding midfielders to match up against the two holding midfielders, or the two of the midfielders from Mexico, but then their front three playing more man-oriented to then press the first line of the Mexico defense. Although the 5-2-3 matched up pretty well with the Mexico offensive organization structure, a few problems occurred when individual mistakes were made and exploited. So here we have an on-the-ball action that occurred of the beating of the American holding midfielder Weston McKennie, which then allowed Mexico to utilize their midfield structure and attack via the half space in advanced positions. So here we have the full midfield shape for Mexico, with two advanced midfielders via inside wingers or offensive midfielders. Stemming from the holding midfielders, the two holding midfielders play through the central corridor, playing more narrow, creating diagonal passing options into the progressive space. In the second half, the United States switched from a 5-2-3 to a 4-3-3, and it gave them a little bit better spatial control and compactness, and distances between the players became shorter and gave them a higher level of control in certain areas because the United shape was more condensed. And we can see that here, as we see generally in the midfield and first line of pressure for the United States, the players are closer together, giving them a higher level of spatial control on the platform, but Mexico were able to get past this when they vacated the pivot area, which is what they did here, which ultimately rendered the United States formation switch useless because Mexico's priority wasn't actively building through this zone. It was vacating the zone to then have movement go through here and manipulating the United States' defensive shape to then get on the ball between the lines and in higher areas. And with the back four now from the United States, it made them less likely to jump to these players of Mexico between the lines, as we see here with their two holding midfielders going a bit higher now, and Mexico in the second half using Salida La Volpiana to create a back three, which will then elicit a jumping of their most central defender into the pivot area. So they use this area very dynamically and often were able to have success with it when they did find the third line pass. So here's a situation where Mexico were able to progress now into the final third, and it stemmed from the over-compactness of the United States in the midfield and not having the protection between the lines as they did, with 5 defenders then able to jump and follow runners into this area. So now, with Mexico being able to manipulate the defense and pin defenders into deeper areas, as we see the forward pinning 2 defenders here, the central forward of Mexico pinning 2 central defenders, and then the wide player of Mexico making a forward run allows the player between the lines to move deeper into a ball position and create superiority between the lines to then receive a third line pass and further progress the attack. And I just wanted to show very quickly the Mexico offensive movement to then use the pivot area in a different way than we normally see, with a jumping central defender to occupy the pivot position, leaving 2 defenders in the first line of buildup, which then gave them an extra player between the lines, then try and exploit this lack of jumping ability from the back 4 now of the United States. Now for the United States in possession. In the first third of buildup, they look to create numerical superiority when they use possession as a tool, and they did this via the wide areas, and oftentimes, especially in the first half, the United States built with 3 central defenders, and this allowed them to rotate in the first third of the field to then have an overload on one side. Oftentimes, Gio Reyna was the free player playing between the lines, with Pulisic coming as well between the lines in the half space a lot of times. But in the first third, the holding midfielder, they had a single pivot, and Weston McKennie was used as an 8 to then move higher into the half space, and this was ultimately how they created their rondo structure, and they tried to create 4 versus 2 situations of the United States in favor of the United States versus the Mexico press. When the United States advanced into the midfield third, we have the buildup of their 3 central defenders and their single pivot. Then higher up the field, depending on the actions of their forward and their wingers, they often rotated to have 3 players between the lines to then prepare for a direct play into the forward as the target man and having an adequate second ball structure, or playing as an inside wing back, creating a numerical superiority situation to then try and progress cleanly between the lines. One thing I think the United States could have done better was progression via their central defenders, and they had time and space to move forward with the ball. I think they could have done this, because then the positive field of view they would have a third line progression option between the lines with pinning forward. They would have had a wide player to progress around the block, and they would have had a consolidation option via the holding midfielder to then switch the point of attack if they ran into trouble. But this wasn't used as much, as it didn't suit the qualities of the players, or wasn't a tactic or concept they looked to exploit. When the United States did go long and their forward didn't drop deeper, or they didn't create a diamond in the midfield with 3 advanced players, they always had 3 midfielders though, with their single pivot, Weston McKennie playing as the 8, going higher in the right half space, and then Pulisic, Gio Reyna, or a player like this coming from the wide area into an interior position, trying to create superiority and use their qualities between the lines to progress the attack, gave the United States always a 3-man midfield structure with variability on who occupies this third midfield role, looking as a progressive option higher up the field. And the last picture for the United States, then in the second half, they looked to go to a more of a back 4 with deeper fullbacks to try and pull Mexico out a little bit so they wouldn't sit to a mid block, and then from here they used their same 3-man midfield structure, but having 2 central defenders now, it often gave them the ability to create width through their fullbacks, and now their wingers were able to then invert more freely and get on the ball between the lines and try and manipulate the Mexico defense and create superiority through a player in the blind side of the midfield of Mexico. So that's the analysis, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the channel. It's a huge help, and I will see you in the next one.